Okay, good morning, Dr. Molina. I hope that you are doing well. This is me, Emily Packer, and I am submitting my project for EDUC 604. This assignment is assignment 4B, Exploring Marginalized Children in Nepal. So I sent you my Padlet last night, which has all of the information on it. And then today I'm going to just talk through this information and provide my personal thoughts and musings. I did this last night and then Zoom crashed, so I was not able to salvage the recording. So this is my attempt number two. So here we go. Let's check out my Padlet. So before we get started, I just want to share that in order to be able to do this project, I had to do a deep dive into the history of education and just basically the history of Nepal in general. And so that helped me understand the Nepali system so much more. It helped me understand what's happening in today's world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk back through history, and then that's going to inform us about the marginalized children. There's four groups mainly who are out of school. And so this historical context will be able to provide the background for why these four groups are out of school. So let's start way back when. So we are now in the Lichavi period, which is 400 to 750 CE. So way back. This is in the beginning of the region that is now Nepal. And there's have been speculations about the formal education in this period because there's evidence of engineering, metalwork, and architecture. The architecture was stunning from back then. So the assumption is there had to be some sort of formal education system in place to produce people to be this skilled. Interestingly enough, Nepal is home for a few different major religions that coexist very peacefully today. These are Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians, amongst others. At this period, it's thought that the Buddhist tradition and religion had a lot of influence because in this time period, in regioning um, other regional countries, Buddhists had monasteries where they taught monks. And so they did have a form of formal education. So the Lichavi period is the beginning of our history of Nepal. And there was evidence for some sort of formal education period in this time. Let's fast forward a little bit to the 11th century. This is the advent of the Sankaracharya. I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. I did practice that before this. And this is when Buddhist institutions in Nepal were attacked. So there was lots of book burning, institutions were burnt to the ground, Buddhists were killed. And this was a period of destruction. And so we don't have very many books from this time period or written texts, but we do have evidence that the Hindus at this point came in and they said this is not the religion people should be following. And they tried to get rid of as much Buddhist influence as possible. And the Hindu system of education evolved, and it's still in Nepal today. They use the Gurukul model. Guru means teacher, and Shishaya means pupil. So at this point, formal education was really in the form of tutoring. So gurus to their pupils, individual work. Another form of education at this time is between father and son, and not father and daughter, not mother and daughter, or mother or son, but traditionally father to son. And so in this case, the fathers were considered the gurus. And education consisted of learning, ritual, prayer, and reading religious texts. Only those born in the upper class, or sorry, I'll say upper caste, were educated. And because it was only them that they were deemed appropriate to be educated. So again, this was the Gurukul model in the Hindu education system, focused on tutoring and passing knowledge in a semi-formal structure from teacher to student, and then also from father to son. At this time, Sanskrit schools were introduced into the high caste children. These were called patsalas. And this was the population that didn't have to do manual labor to earn a living. And so education was seen as appropriate for them. Interestingly, these schools were funded using guthi, which is the grants and gifts from government and other devout parties. Although there were guthi from the government, these schools, these Sanskrit patsalas, which still exist today, were very independent from the government. And so they were doing their own thing. They were very individualized, very localized. So this was not the beginning of a formal, organized federal education system. The reason somebody would go into these pathalas was then to gain entrance into the Sanskrit college at Benares, and this was a requirement. So although other students could apply to this college, oftentimes those that were accepted because they had formal training in the pathalas. Now comes the education under the Ranas. So now we're in the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, and the Ranas were a ruling monarch. They're a family who ruled for a very long time. And in the mid 1800s, a few Ranas went abroad to England and France, and they came back to Nepal with an idea for modernization. So they decided we need education to modernize our country. But what they did was they actually just created a high school within the palace grounds that was only accessible to Rana children. And so their version of modernization was just offering education to their own kids. Fast forward a little bit, and one of the Rana prime ministers said, "This isn't actually right. We need to be including others." So he moved the high school to outside of the palace grounds. This is called Durbar High School. Durbar means palace. And it was opened up to other high caste children who were not part of the Rana family. I thought that that was pretty interesting that somebody did have the wherewithal to say, hey, if we're going to modernize our country, we need to include others outside of our own family. The curriculum was based on the British curriculum of English, math, history, and geography. But what is important about this is the history and geography that were taught were those of India and Europe. And so this was to instill a sense of inferiority to Nepalis as they were deemed less important, less powerful, less intelligent, and they were taught the curriculum from outside of their country. So even those within the Rana family and high caste, they were uh, seen as inferior. And this school was created to then educate those to then go into government positions. And so the only ones at this point, because the caste system was alive and well at this time, the only people at that point who could go into government positions were the Ranas and then the upper caste children. This was the beginning of education as a symbol of power and prestige. And this high school was the only other formal school in Nepal for the next 40 years. Then we're going to talk about this amazing guy, Dev Shumsher Rana. He was called the Idealist, and he was in power he was the prime minister for about 4 months. And the reason he was only in power for 4 months was because he decided that he wanted to take the education to the people. So he opened up over 200 primary schools throughout the country. And he thought that this would be an amazing tool to uplift those out of the caste system, out of poverty. And for that, he was exiled. So the Ranas said, oh, no, 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 no. Education is ours and we cannot spread it throughout the people. So that's a tool for us only because we like the status quo. We don't need people rising up and invading our space and challenging that. So he was exiled and everything went back to normal. Then we have what's called the Nepali language Patsalas. So previously we talked about the Sanskrit Patsalas, and these are the Nepali language ones. So these, remember, Patsalas means schools. So the Ranas realized in order to have supporting workers, so in the clerical class, they needed people to be trained, but they couldn't be trained in Durbar High School. They had to be trained elsewhere. So the Nepali language Patsalas were open, again, mostly to only high-born, so high caste male students. And these patsalas were funded by the state, not just Guthi, which is, as we talked about, more gifts and donations. These were funded by the state, so they were not as independent as the previous Sanskrit patsalas. And I have to imagine that is because these schools were breeding grounds for clerical workers to then support government workers. So the government needed some oversight over who was being educated, how they were being educated, to then best support those in leadership. There was the first college in Nepal was founded in 1918, and this was really just another location for Durbar High School students to then go into, another stepping stone before getting these government positions. So the school had courses like economics, civics, English, history, geography, Nepali, Sanskrit, physics, chemistry. So it had a lot of courses that were not usually or not previously offered. Interestingly, though, the quality of the graduates were not very high, and there was a very big gap between what the students learned in their school and then what they went into professionally. So oftentimes that didn't coexist. There was no linkage there. So what happened when the Ranas needed specializations, or people who were specialized in certain areas, is they sent those individuals abroad. So those individuals went to Europe, they went to other places in Asia, they went to the United States, and then they came back and practiced medicine, engineering. So they did not have any special training within Nepal in the early 19th century that had to do with higher degrees, so higher education past a comparable bachelor's degree. So this was also the beginning of students, only Rana children, being sent away abroad to receive training and then coming back. And this practice is still very, very alive and well in the United States, in Nepal. Today, lots and lots of Nepali students go elsewhere for specialized training and come back to Nepal. So what happened here, I just wanted to mention this, is India gained independence from Great Britain, which inadvertently affected Nepal, because Nepal was, if we want to think of Nepal as kind of India's little sister, in regard to that they share lots of similar customs and traditions, very similar languages. And so when India gained independence, Mahatma Gandhi opened all these schools called the basic schools throughout India, and then also tried to open some in Nepal. And so you would think that at this time, maybe Nepal would be open to this. These schools were based on skill training, commitment to work. However, because education was still seen as a right to the high caste born individuals who didn't, they thought they were above skill training and they didn't really want to commit to work. And this was not the purpose of education. In Nepal, the purpose of education was more of a formality, a stepping stone to then get these government positions. So these new schools, or sorry, the basic schools, never took off in Nepal. And that speaks to something I'm going to talk about later, which is the perspectives of education in Nepal. Education is still a struggle. People still see this as a means to an end rather than learning for learning's sake. But we will come back to that. In the 1950s, we had the Nepali Revolution, and education skyrocketed. So the Ranas were overthrown for the first time in centuries, and the government sector boomed. So there's tons more white collar, blue collar jobs, which caused people to flood into schools. There was not the infrastructure to support this, so schools were built, and then this was a time where the caste system was abolished as well. So people within certain castes were then able to start thinking about what can I do professionally, whereas before your profession was assigned to you at birth. And so people saw education as a ticket out of the previously constraints of the caste system. So, in theory, it shouldn't matter what your last name was or where you were born or who your family is. If you have the education, you can apply to these jobs equitably. But as we know, that's never really what happens, and that's not what happened in Nepal. The literacy rate was still only 2% at this time, but education was beginning to get its legs here. So the educational expanse at the local level really came from the people. But interesting, it wasn't the upper caste people, because the upper caste really wanted to maintain the status quo still, despite it being illegal, the caste system at this point. And it wasn't the ethnic minorities. When I was reading, it wasn't the ethnic minorities who were calling for education. My sources said that they weren't, quote, interested in it, which I think is very subjective and questionable. Who was calling for this were the middle castes, and who had the means to organize, had the means and the, I would say, influence to organize, uh, gather funds locally, and build schools for their own children. And so at this point, schools were popping up all over the place, especially away from these major cities. And this was a people-driven movement, really for the people, by the people, using local resources, and getting kids educated. But there was no central education system, and the local schools received minimal support from the government at this time. Interestingly, at this time, the Americans had a huge influence over Nepal in terms of the where the education system went. So the U.S. in the 1950s, after the revolution, provided the technical and financial resources to Nepal, and then also joined with Nepali advisors to talk through education in a federal sense. So what happened was they organized the National Education Planning Commission. They founded the first College of Education. And when I say they, I mean Nepali and American advisors together. They founded the normal schools, which were mobile training schools for primary teachers. The US also helped develop multi-purpose high schools that included some technical training, and helped organize the first university, different than the first college, the first university in Nepal, which is the Tribhuvan University, which is still standing today. I've driven by it a few times. It is beautiful. So I'd like to dig into this a little bit more about why the US came in and started helping at this time. But you can still see imprints of the US throughout the Nepali education system organizationally. And what happened was the government decided to have a government approved and mandated curriculum. So the Ministry of Education at this time expanded into regional offices, and these offices were tasked with distributing small amounts of money from the state, inspecting performance levels, and granting permission to build more schools. So this is where we really see the organization starting to happen. So we have the Ministry of Education in Kathmandu. We then see it expand to regional offices all throughout Nepal. And then these regional offices have the leadership and the power to then support local schools, build more schools, but especially inspect performance levels. And that is then very tied to the amount of money schools would get. So here is the first time that we see performance levels being linked to funding. So education was still more of a status symbol, and really had little to do with the local needs. So the government curriculum is still today extremely disjointed from the local needs and desires and dreams of the people of Nepal. The government curriculum was one of the most frustrating aspects of leading Trek to Teach, and because our teachers had to teach the curriculum, and this curriculum was the opposite of culturally informed. And so it oftentimes had little to do with the students themselves. Then Nepal had what's called the National Education System Plan, and this was executed towards the end of the 1960s. All of these schools were nationalized and supported by the government with an increase in educational budget. So the budget increased, which was a huge step forward. And yet the graduation rates were still pretty poor. The literacy rates were rising, but not to the point where the government thought that it would be. So the NESP was pretty rushed. And what happened was the government said, hey, the graduation rates are poor. We need to figure out what the students are learning and how well they're doing. So this is when standardized tests were introduced and semesters were introduced. So students began to be tested at the end of every semester. And that was to gauge student learning and understanding, and try to figure out, hey, why are the graduation rates so poor? In addition to these standardized tests, students were asked to demonstrate their knowledge on a more regular basis for the first time as well. And so although this high intensity focus on test taking, um, is still today one of the benchmarks of Nepali education. And so what happens is that, and has happened, is a surge of cheating throughout the national and standardized tests, and then teaching to the tests, and then students focus on performing test wise instead of being comprehensible. And I will say the purpose is not fluency. I'll put that in quotes in terms of math or English or anything. The purpose is to do well on the exams. So what happened during this time, because the NESP pretty much backfired, the government curriculum was not doing that well. There was still lots of people struggling with literacy. It was a non-formal education sector came up, and they came up in a big way in 1970s and 80s. And so NGOs and NGOs exploded during this time. Lots of government organizations, marginalized groups were targeted to then be able to support them in their literacy efforts. So like adult literacy, there's projects like Education for Rural Development, and then other specific groups targeting children took root in the non-formal sector. So there were many, many organizations who said, hey, this public education system is not doing it. It is not serving the needs of most. So we need to come in and offer other alternatives. And an example of one of those alternatives, the Primary Education Project. And this was initiated by the Ministry of Education and Culture and founded by the World Bank. So this was in the 1980s. So we see the influence of the World Bank and other major international corporations coming in, organizations coming in and starting to influence Nepali education. So what grew from this was a lot more programs, such as the out of school program, the women's education program, adult education program. And all of these were funded by the Ministry of Education and Culture, as well as the World Bank. So the non-formal sector started this with local organizations, government organizations. And then we see in the 80s, the international organizations coming in and providing funding and explaining who needs to be educated. So Education for All happened in the 1990s at the Jomtien conference in Thailand. Nepal was extremely inspired. The Ministry of Education and Culture declared its intentions to adopt the Education for All policies, and they went straight ahead. They targeted 8 million people between the ages of 6 and 45 and increased the literacy rates by 33%, which is just a huge jump. And so during this time, the Primary Education Project then grew into the Basic and Primary Education Project, and then was funded by UNICEF and Danida, which is the Danish international education organization. So at that point in the 1990s, grades 1 through 10 became tuition free. However, does not mean that it was free to go to public school, because students still needed to pay their transportation costs for their uniforms, costs for their materials. So although Education for All did a great job identifying millions of people, bringing them into the public education system, the literacy rates did rise. There were still groups that were being left out for various reasons that we will then talk about in just a minute. So at this point, Nepal was doing really well. Over the last few decades, education since the 50s had grown and grown and grown, become more formalized, become more structured. More and more children were being identified and brought into schools. The graduation rates and literacy rates were increasing. However, political turmoil struck in the beginning of the 21st century. So this was when the Nepalese royal massacre happened, where the crown prince came in and killed 9 of his family members, and then he himself died. So what happened here is then it gave way to almost a decade of political instability. Basically, a civil war happened where the Maoists, the communists, wanted to rise to power. The crown was still contending with that. There was lots and lots and lots of turmoil during this. And so education fell to the wayside because there was no formal government that was giving support, that was organized, that had strong leaders. Nepal was just struggling to get its feet back from underneath them. And when they did in 2008, Nepal became a democracy. They then had one prime minister, and then turned over to a second prime minister. She is still in power right now in 2015. And so at that point, there had been about, maybe 5 years of okay stability and 5 years of attention to being given to education again. And then the 2015 earthquake happened in Nepal. This killed over 9,000 people and hurt over 22,000. Infrastructure in Kathmandu and Pokhara, in the foothills, in the plains, in the mountains, were destroyed throughout the whole country. And so again, Nepal has had to redivert its efforts, its funding, its manpower to a different need. So now we're looking at a natural disaster need. So physically, schools were obliterated. Students and teachers were killed. Members of the Ministry of Education were killed. All of this happened. And so again, we're left attending to the basic needs of Nepalis before then moving into the educational needs. And this leads us to who is out of school right now. So this happened 7 years ago. There's been 7 years of with reconstruction, growth, and a lot of stability. But we still see these out of school children walking around in Nepal, trying to figure out how to provide money for their families, and thinking about the cultural, economic, and social expectations of these kids. So I found varying sources for how many kids are out of school in Nepal. So it varies from 100,000 from UNESCO and World Bank, to about 900,000, and that was by world partners. And so there's a good amount of students still out of school. The four main groups of children who are out of school are those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, girls, low caste students, and those with geographical barriers. And so we're going to talk about why that exists. So why are they out of school? Children still form a major portion of the economic workforce, especially for those in low socioeconomic background families. They provide a lot of the manpower for agricultural families, farmers, metal workers, any of the technical trades. A lot of the families still train their own children to go into the family trade. And so children are still a big part of the economic workforce. There is a deep-rooted gender bias and discrimination in Nepal that still exists. And so female students are often pulled from schools so that their brothers are able to stay in schools, and also for them to get married. So the minimum age of marriage in Nepal is 20, but child marriage is still a major issue. And so we see 12 and 13-year-olds being pulled from school to get married and then go and help support and work in their husband's family. So gender bias is a major contributing factor to who is out of school. Key barriers to enrollment include poverty, like we've talked about, social exclusion. So here we're talking about the lower caste students. So although the caste system was abolished decades ago, it still exists informally in Nepal today. So when I was in Nepal, there was a school that was within a region that served basically one caste, and this caste was traditionally a lower caste. And these kids, it was to 8th grade, and then they didn't have a upper secondary school. So in order to then go to upper secondary, they would have had to walk 2.5 hours uphill to get to the nearest school. And that school was in a part of the region that was specific towards a different caste. And there was lots of bias, lots of discrimination, lots of prejudice happening. So students didn't want to do that. They didn't want to walk 2.5 hours one way to school to then be met with a lot of hostility from other students, as well as parents and teachers. There's also something we haven't talked about is disability in Nepal. That's a reason that kids are out of school: migration, child labor, social norms, and gender bias. Something we've mentioned earlier is the indirect costs of education, like transportation and materials and clothing. Geographical location affects the children's ability to access school. Like I've just mentioned, they might not have schools in their region. They might have to travel. They might have to go into the cities. There's two major cities. There's Kathmandu and Pokhara. So that means leaving their village, their culture, their family. And so lots of communities are also isolated. We think about the Sherpas in the southern region, who are very far from Kathmandu, very far from Pokhara. And so access to education is limited. And sociocultural factors, specifically ethnicity, affect a child's ability to cope. So to almost finish up, perspectives on education in Nepal are still, we still see the roots of the education system reflected in the current perspective. So passing grades are the goal, not necessarily skill and knowledge attainment. So as I mentioned, there's lots of cheating that happens in the standardized tests. It is the teachers teach to the test. The national curriculum is what supports the test. And it's very, 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 very little to do with the students themselves. So education is not seen as a betterment knowledge wise. It's seen as a stepping stone for a job. Also, the educated now equate themselves with the upper caste people, and they don't want to do manual labor. There's, again, manual labor is seen as a lower class and caste job. And so the upper caste and those who are educated, who now see themselves in the upper class and caste, try to distance themselves from that. And so what I mentioned earlier is if somebody is born to a traditionally lower caste, they will then use education to pull themselves out of manual labor jobs. And so education here is seen as an escape. And it's not often that people think critically about their desired profession. As we mentioned earlier, usually these were dictated by their caste and their families and their elders. So it's still very common for kids to go try to do what their parents tell them. So what their parents deem as socially acceptable. So they should be in school to then go to college, then to achieve a job in a certain profession. So it's very often that their parents dictate what their children can and cannot do. And very often is dictated around gender lines in this cases. So thinking about a organization that has been promoted by the government that has actually done some work that is empirically supported is the GATE program. So the GATE program is the Girls Access to Education program, and it's funded by UNICEF and the Nepalese government. Now, I chose the GATE program out of literally dozens and dozens and dozens of programs that I saw that are currently working in Nepal. Again, there were about, I think the research said there's over 400 NGOs and INGOs in like the 90s in Nepal, and it's only grown. So there are so many organizations, so many outside influences coming in and trying to fix the education system in Nepal. What I love about the GATE program was that it's partnered with UNICEF and the Nepali government, and it's run by local individuals. So what this does is this targets girls who are the most vulnerable and provides them with access to 9 months of classes that basically catch them up to where they need to be to then enter mainstream education. So what I thought was so unique about this program is there are outreach workers that work with the girls' families and community leaders to convince them that girls' education is worthwhile. And so these outreach workers go there with the purpose to change the mindsets on women's education and the value of girls being in school. The GATE program also relies on the Equity Index to target support, and this index was developed to support and capture data on the disparities in education in Nepal, and it launched in 2016. And since it's launched, the specific Equity Index, the targeted districts, the out of school children have decreased by 60%. So we see this data that's supporting the program. For example, in the last few years, the GATE program has facilitated the enrollment or re-enrollment of over 10,000 out of school girls. And it made it possible for these girls to enter mainstream education. So these courses are math and English, traditional school courses, but they also provide courses in hygiene and social etiquette so that these girls are able to then go to school and not feel are not ostracized for social things. Now, on the surface, I think this program sounds pretty wonderful, and it's obviously been making an impact. However, I keep going back to that article that we read, Three Cups of Deceit, where they talk about girls in particular being encouraged to go to school and then not really following through on where they end up, and where oftentimes they end up in the cities and have to resort to sex work. So my skepticism kicks in here because I'm thinking, okay, so the GATE program basically pulls these students, conditions them to be appropriate enough to then enter mainstream education, and mainstream education is dictated by the government. And so then they are educated, so they're pulled from their culture and their families and their responsibilities. But then what happens to them? And I couldn't find information on that. I found a lot of testimonials about girls who are in the GATE program who are saying, "Oh, I would have been married by now. Both my sisters got married at 12, and now I'm in school, and I'm so thankful." And I think that that is so powerful. But I'm wondering where they end up. Like, do they end up in lower secondary? Do they pass? Do they go to upper secondary? Do they pass? Do they go to college? Like, where do they end up? What jobs are there? Are there enough jobs for these women who will then be educated, or these girls who then will be educated? Especially if they're being pulled from the positions culturally and familially that they're in. So I want to keep thinking about this and digging into this because I'm just missing a lot of outcomes, data about the outcomes here, because it's not just getting the students into school, as we've been talking about, it's seeing what they do with this and what opportunities are for them. I know that Nepal has a shortage of jobs, especially with COVID. The industries have been shut down, and all of the Nepalis I know have been struggling to provide to provide for their families. And so I just wonder, where are these positions that these girls are then being trained for? Because if they're not in Nepal, then what is education doing? Education is conditioning them to then be workers, to be sent to other countries. I know a lot of Nepalese workers are sent to the UAE and countries in that area, and then they send money home. So I'm just not really sure about the purpose of education here. Um, if there, yeah, so I could talk a lot more about that. But so overall, Nepal has had a history that has kind of dabbled in formal education from the beginning, with the influence of the Buddhist tradition, to then the uh, entry of Hindu traditions and the Hindu schools and the Sanskrit schools, to then the one college that was in Kathmandu from like the 1918, Durbar High School, which moved and symbolized power and prestige, the first university that was help funded by the United States. Really, Nepal's education system has pretty much started in terms of public education and government organized in the 1950s, really got its legs in the 70s and 80s, and was on track in the 90s through Education for All. But then with the extreme political issues and then the natural disaster, really put a pause on the progress of education. So what we're looking at is that we're looking at a country today that is still getting its feet underneath it. It's still trying to move forward with education, but there's been a lot of hurdles. And so there's major disconnects that remain between the government and the the regional agencies, the local schools, the government curriculum, but the local needs. There's not connection between all of these. And so I just think when we think about the Nepali education system, we're trying to bring people in, we're trying to bring the marginalized students into a system that is still pretty rocky. The outcomes are not um, great. The students would still geographically, students would have to leave their communities in order to pursue higher education, pursue jobs in the government, or even just jobs in, sales, local businesses and industries. And so I wonder if if Nepal is trying to do too much without kind of focusing back on the foundational aspects of the education system. So moving forward, I do want to explore that. Think about, are there things being done? Last I checked, when I was leading Trek to Teach, there weren't. Are there things being done between to to connect those that are outside of the two major cities to the education system, and to what benefit? Um, so that's where I'm at in my research of Nepal. The four major groups that are the marginalized children who are out of school are, just to repeat myself one more time before ending, are female students, those from the lower caste families and cultures, um, those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as those who are dealing with geographical barriers. And there's lots of intersection amongst all of these. So you think of a female student born in a lower caste who most likely is from a lower socioeconomic background in a geographical location far from the cities. And you think about the challenges of reaching the student, the challenges of convincing the parents and the community to send the student to school, the challenge to get the student to school, and the ramifications of pulling these students away from where they were born and live, to be put into mass education. So thank you so much for listening to this. I'm so sorry this was so long. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to continuing my research on Nepal. Thank you.